Thanks for joining us today. We have a great conversation about spending, everybody's favorite topic. And so Holly and I are going to dive in a little bit to what spending looks like for owners on the personal side and some of the unique challenges that they face. Holly, you want to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's a few really unique things that business owners deal with there. For one, they're used to very open architecture spending from the company. And, of course, early on for an entrepreneur, they may be really having to be kind of scrappy and survive from a financial standpoint. So later when the company's more mature and doing well, I'm sure it feels really good. Like, hey, I can just spend whatever I need to, um, or want to. And so there may not be a lot of thought given to, how much do we need to spend? And if we were to sell the company someday, what does that look like? And how much money do I need to pull to be financially free? So that, and then there's some other nuances that are really unique to business owners, I think.
Yeah, so let's just take a step back a little bit, and I think we'll spend the first part trying to define the issue a little bit, and just describing what spending looks like for business owners, and then we can get into some of those unique challenges. And then lastly, we can talk about some possible solutions or some ways to look at it. But I think you brought up a good point, and that is we're looking at this in the context of financial freedom, because one half of that equation is not just what my company's worth or what I've saved personally, but how much do I need to spend, or do I want to spend to then make those things work together, to understand what your financial freedom is. And so a lot of times it's really hard for us to know that spending number. Most people can figure out their net worth pretty quick, but if we ask people how much they spend, that's a little harder, and they usually undershoot a little bit. So I think you brought up a good point, and I think what I want to talk about first is that there's this unique dynamic that you have when you're the owner of the company, and that is that you have this dynamic where you control both sides of your financial life in a way, in the sense that you can determine how much you want to spend. You can decide, what you're doing on the personal side, just like anybody else. You determine how much you spend on groceries and what kind of house you buy and what kind of cars you drive, and you drive those decisions yourself. Whereas where you're different from a typical W-2 employee, where you're getting a paycheck, you have a very, very consistent idea of what's coming in every month, and that's just really driven by your salary, and your compensation arrangement. There's not a lot of variability there. You don't have a ton of control over that. Versus when you own a company, especially once you've hit your growth phase and you've gotten through those kind of tighter years, you have the ability to kind of control how much you bring down every month. If you need more, you can take a bigger draw, or you can go find more business. And so that can lead to maybe some overspending in some cases. So why don't you tell me what you've seen in your practice?
Yeah. So, like you said, the income is usually divided into two tranches. You have the salary that's being drawn, and then you have distributions. And distributions could be very methodical, where there's some kind of a formula that the business owners come up with, or maybe it's very random. Maybe it's very, hey, I need some money, I'm going to pull it out. And so, not a lot of discipline there. And then also, you have typically, I see a lot of business owners will run a lot of personal expenses through the business legitimately. For example, maybe they have a company car that they drive, or they have a cell phone that they are using for business, and that's being deducted by the business. And so, because those expenses are being run through the company, they may not know exactly what their personal budget is, because they do have these two different buckets. The feeling that, oh, yeah, if I want to have more discretionary money, I can just hustle more and create more revenue. You know, after retirement or after someone sells their company, there could be a feeling of constraint or I no longer have control, which could be a really big dynamic shift in the future. And so, really having an understanding of what are my needs, what are my wants, and trying to map those out, figuring out how much is in the personal bucket versus the business bucket that's being spent for personal needs, and trying to extract those numbers is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like it's almost like we see them go through a couple phases. The first one being when you're just getting started and you don't have a lot of profits. You're barely paying yourself. You're probably the last one that you end up paying something to. If you have employees, they're coming first. Reinvesting in the business is coming first. So everybody I think that makes it and makes their business work probably has a period where they've had to tighten their belt and be pretty disciplined on the personal side in order to get past that phase. Like that's just kind of goes with the territory. So we see a lot of people that have a lot of discipline in spending. It's just like anything else. Like once you have an abundance, you just stop tracking it. It's not that you're being irresponsible. It's just that you don't necessarily have to anymore. And so
Right.
you kind of stop. And I think that's a very natural place for people to end up. And then, like you said, people, if they sell and they may not get enough for it or they haven't done the math, they may feel like they're constrained, and that's not a feeling that's really good after you've been free for so long. To get back, back in that situation can be really challenging. And so it's why it's one of the reasons why people don't sell, because they continue to have that lifestyle. So it's a matter, I think, trying to get to a place where you really understand what you're spending, and then you're able to maybe do something about it. So, and that's kind of what we'll get to a little bit in the solutions.
Yeah, understanding what your lifestyle need is and the need and the want. I always like to divide it into those two things because buying groceries and paying utilities is very different from going on vacation every year or spending money on hobbies or giving money to kids, things like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's a natural thing when you try to think about what you spend, people they may have a pretty good idea what the need thing is, right? Because they can kinda do the math really quick on how
Right,
much they spend on bills and mortgage, groceries, car payments, that kinda stuff, but that's just to get started every month. That doesn't include, like, the things you really wanna go do, or
right.
the bigger months where you do your traveling in the summer or whatever, spring break, when you maybe have some higher spending months or Christmas time. You're not really thinking about that when you're doing your budgeting. So anyway, so maybe we can talk about there's kind of a dirty word in our world called budgeting, and people don't really like to budget. They do it when they really have to, maybe earlier on in their career because they have to, right? But my experience, and maybe you can maybe tell me what you've seen, but when I think of budgeting, or I've seen people try it, it when you're really motivated, it can work for a little bit, right? You can work for a couple months or for 6 months or maybe in a year, right? If you're really really motivated by something, but budgeting can really just lead to frustrations, because a lot of times I think people pick arbitrary numbers that sound good in these categories. They haven't really thought about what they actually spent. They just kind of say, well, let's do this and this. And then it just really leads to it leads to them being frustrated because they fail, or then they can't do the thing that they wanted to do, or whatever. And then I think here's where people go. They go like, we have a tendency to focus on the small things and ignore the big things. So we're like, well, I can just stop eating out. But the real issue is, well, maybe it's that car lease that's, more than really you should have, or maybe it's the car payment or the mortgage. Like these are the big items, right? I had somebody tell me one time that if you get your student loans right, if you get your car right and you get your house right, it doesn't matter where you go eat. You can do whatever you want. And so I think that's kind of advice to live by. But back to the budgeting thing, I just see that spin out a little bit. And it never changes. And so I want to talk a little bit about what maybe can help reframe that. But why don't you tell me a little bit about what you've experienced with budgeting?
Yeah, I think budgeting is for a lot of people a negative word. It's a negative feeling. It's a feeling of somebody's going to put me in a box.
Yeah.
but I think it can also be very empowering. In my personal experience, when I've really have reconnected with different expenses and understanding where money is going,
Hmm.
it's helping me feel more in control versus out of control. And like
Okay.
I am proactively able to decide where my money goes. A lot of times owners are putting all their money back into their business, and
Yeah.
understanding how much they need to spend can also help them see like how much discretionary money is there from the business and in their personal cash flow that they could save money outside the business. Um, and I think there, as you alluded to, there are some things that people can do to make it easier. One thing I talk to people about is getting their annual credit card statement at the end of each year and seeing what categories everything is going to, because for a lot of people, that's where most of their spending occurs. They're trying to get points and accumulate rewards. And so that's a very trackable thing for one. A lot of times that also is where discretionary spending is. So that tells us how much is going to shopping and travel and those types of things.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really good. Yeah, so doing like like a self audit at the end of the year where you're maybe not looking at everything micro, but you're like, where did my money go? Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Then you came up with a really good idea that I think has helped a lot of our clients, and that is having them subscribe to a service that will connect their checking and their credit card accounts in, and it will categorize all those expenses electronically for them and enable them to see from the various buckets that they spend from how much is going to these various areas without having to go back and analyze their credit card statements and their, pull checking account records, and that can just feel very cumbersome, and it can be very cumbersome. And so we've got technology tools now that are incredibly easy, and that's something that we offer as part of our service to help them get all of that organized.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the idea of spending awareness as opposed to budgeting, because I think budgeting a lot of times puts the line items first. And with spending awareness, we flip it on its head a little bit, and we're like, okay, let's just take a breath and let's really go back in time and just look, where did our money go? Because that's what people don't often do. And that can be in my view and what I've seen is that can be very freeing to just kind of say, wow, okay. It's just a reflection. It's just holding a mirror to yourself when you do something like that. And there's no reason to. It's not like it's not an exercise meant to make you feel guilty or anything. It's just an exercise to say like, hey, here's where everything went. And there's a saying that says like, whatever you value, if you want to figure out what you value, you see where you spend your money, and it kind of shows where your value is. So there's a lot of important insights you can gain or we can gain from where your money goes. Like we can see what's important to you, which is a good thing. Uh, but I think on on the spending awareness front, um, what it really then does empowers you to do is once you know where it's gone, it's not about creating like all these rigid budget categories moving forward. Then it can be more about like how do I gamify this? How do I say like last year I spent whatever on eating out, and I really have a goal. I feel like I did that too much. So if I spend $1,000 a month eating out, now I know that now. I've looked at my averages, and now I'm going to say I'm going to beat that in January, and I'm going to do less than that. And so you kind of gamify that by comparing it to yourself. There's an interesting. Hold on, I've got a great. Okay, there's a good example of this. So there was an energy company that wanted to get people to like to conserve energy, to not use power in their homes as much. And they create all these incentives, financial incentives, all these incentives to get people to consume less energy, and nothing worked. They couldn't do rebates. They couldn't do that. They couldn't get anybody to decrease their. They tried to say, hey, it's good for the environment. Try to appeal to those people. It didn't work. What worked was they were like, we're going to average the use of energy in the area, and we're going to tell everybody what the average use in the area is, and then you can see where you are compared to the average. And what they found was people that use more energy than the average, they actually consume less. But they did find that people that consumed less and they saw they were below the average, they actually consumed a little more. Um, which kind of goes to the point of what we're looking for in spending. It's like you want it to go where it's important to you. You want to spend money where you feel like it's important. And once you understand your values and you're like, hey, travel, what we're trying to do is get you to do this. What we want people to feel empowered is empowered to spend the money in a way that they enjoy it and that really speaks to their values. So if spending time with family is what's important to you, and you like to go do exotic things like go on trips, well, like we want you to get to a place where you don't feel guilty about spending the money to do that, because that's aligned with your values. It's about where's maybe excess in other areas where you can say, oh, okay, here's where I'm spending that I could reduce, but I want to increase spending here or continue doing what I'm doing here because that's important to me. That lines up with my values. And what Holly and I do at the beginning of a planning engagement is we try to figure out what people's values are. We want to talk through that and do an exercise so that we know when they are spending in these areas to try to say, hey, this is where it lines right up with number one value. So this is great. This is, you're aligned. It doesn't matter how much you're spending. We're not trying to get people to just spend less and save more all the time. It's about spreading that spending over time and maximizing enjoyment of your wealth and income over time. So
Yeah, and there's some things that we can pivot off of once we know what a spending number is. It helps us know what is your magic number for financial freedom, because we know a certain percentage of your wealth is distributable as cash flow for,
can we put a number to that really quick so people can visualize that?
yeah, the general number is at 65. We say 4% of whatever you're
Yeah.
withdrawing is sustainable for 25 years on average.
So if I need 100,000 a year, so that's telling me that how I need, well, maybe that's not a easy number for you, but if I need $80,000 a year, like how much wealth do I need?
2 million,
Okay. And okay, so that kind of shows you like, okay, now, well, what if I spend 160,000 a year? How much do I need?
4 million.
I need 4 million. So you put numbers to that, I think helps to know like that. And that also can motivate somebody to say, oh, okay, here's where I'll cut on spending so I can be financially free once you kind of understand how those numbers relate to each other. So,
Right.
yeah.
Where's that 2 million or 4 million going to come from? Is it going to come from the sale of my company? Is it going to come from me partially exiting and taking income from the company and maybe income from money I've saved or invested? So there could be a wide variety of things there. Another thing we pivot off of with cash flow is how much emergency cash should people have? And generally, if they're retired, for example, we would recommend that they have a year's worth of spending in the one, actually 1 to 3 years worth of spending set aside in something safe. And business owners may have a tendency to have too much in cash because they've taken all the risk in their company and they're not necessarily comfortable taking risk outside the business.
Yeah.
It's a good discussion for us to have with them about how much cash to have that's reasonable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also when you're talking about cash levels, this also really relates to spending in the sense that some people feel like maybe they feel like, man, this whatever my spending is bothering me or I feel strapped, right? But maybe it's not even a spending problem. It's a lack of cash it's a lack of liquidity problem. There's a lot of times where that's the case where the feeling strapped isn't necessarily what you're spending every month. It's like we just don't have enough in liquidity, and that's maybe where we need to focus energy, and then you'll feel more free. And once you have enough liquidity, like a good rule of thumb is like year's worth of your expenses in liquid assets. It doesn't have to be cash, but at least in liquid assets that you could turn into cash if you needed to. So outside of retirement accounts or business equity, something like that. Though that creates a lot of comfort and permission to spend money. That's one of the first questions I ask somebody when if they come to us advice for like buying a car or something like that. Okay, well, after that purchase is done, how much liquidity do you still have left? And do you feel good about that? So those relate to each other very well. I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, there's another thing when we talk about pivoting into retirement from owning a company. Sometimes those pivots need to take place earlier before you actually sell the business. And I was sharing a story with you earlier about a company that we work with that it's a father who's the founder of the business and still 100% owner, and a son who is the hopeful purchaser of the business in the next couple of years. And dad has said, "Hey, look, I'm open to selling you the business, but I need to see certain financial criteria met between now and then, including paying off our line of credit and building up some cash in the business." Well, since COVID, they've had a downturn and they recovered some of that revenue since then, but they're still about a third less than what they were 5, 6 years ago. And so dad is used to taking a salary and he's used to taking distributions and then on top of that, pulling out additional money to cover his income taxes. And the business is struggling to meet, just even some of the basic obligations. I mean, they are profitable, but when you factor in all those distributions, it's hard for his son to meet the criteria that he set forth. And so we sat down and we looked at his personal planning. He had accumulated quite a bit of investment money in retirement accounts and investment accounts. And, he's in his late 60s. And I said, "Hey, why don't you consider backing off of your distribution some and let's pull some money out of your investment accounts and do almost like a partial retirement scenario." And so understanding what his cash flow needs were so that we could figure out how much that needs to be, not putting any more stress than we should on distributions out of the portfolio. And it was like a light bulb went off. Oh, yeah, I could actually make those adjustments. And yeah, that's gonna if I leave five or $10,000 a month with the company, that's still his asset. I mean, that's part of his portfolio, just like his investments are. So it's just allowing the business balance sheet to build up instead of just building his personal balance sheet. So that's
Yeah.
almost the opposite from what we see a lot of times where people leave everything in the company. He was actually putting a little bit too much stress on taking money out of the company.
Yeah. It seems like a good example of like what long-term benefits of diversifying your wealth over time by, taking some of that money down out of the company and into your personal balance sheet and investing it, and then having a good amount of personal wealth creates some freedom and options in the future.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't realize, "Oh, I'm there. I can give myself permission to do this now."
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good place to leave it. Um, unless there's anything else you think we need to add to the spending.
Yeah, I think it's just, spending awareness. I really like your how you express that, becoming more aware, enabling some tools to help you capture things. Also, considering what personal spending is coming out of the business when you're planning for retirement, and also figuring out what's the difference between needs and wants, and really being more clear on, hey, here's my minimums, but here's where I'd like to be.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Very good. All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. And until next time, everyone have a good one.
See you next time.